Now, the current president of Korea, Park Geun-hye, is the daughter of a previous president. The current president of the Philippines is also the son of a previous president. And you'd see this trend in many, many countries, right? Politicians in Indonesia, in Japan, who get up to major levels in politics are often themselves children of other politicians in the past. And this isn't just a trend limited to the developing world. You also see it in the developed world. I mean, George Bush, the son of also George Bush, and his brother Jeb Bush is also contesting. Clintons have created a legacy of power, the Kennedys. So, there are many, many dynasties of power. And in one level, this is not very unusual, right? I mean, many children follow their father or mother's footsteps, and that's what you're open to and what you're interested in. So if your father's a teacher, you want to be a teacher. Your mother's an accountant, maybe you want to be an accountant, and so on and so on and so forth, right? But politicians are different because politicians have so much power. Back in the old days, when you had your father rule and your son rule and then your son's rule, or that was a monarchy, that was a classist system of power. Are we kind of going back to that stage if we say certain families or certain groups of families should be the ones, or not even should be, are the ones who generally tend to rule over everyone else? Is that still a democracy, right? Or are we becoming more like a monarchy, more like an authoritarian type of state? But wait a minute, people can still vote. It's not that they stop people from voting. People keep voting these people back into power. So if people are still voting, then people still have that choice, right? Why do we need to stop people from doing it? I don't know. So this is the debate around banning political dynasties, which is the final week of our debates about politics, and that is looking at the role of individuals within the political system. How much power do these individuals have, and how do you check that power? At the same time, balancing against the rights of those individuals, right? I should have the right, because I'm still a regular citizen, to participate as much as I want within the confines or within the system of my democracy. But if I have too much influence, then does that system of democracy have a right to balance it against me, right? To check against my power or my influence. That is basically the debate about political dynasties, banning the influence or controlling the influence of a few individuals over the larger democracy, and whether or not that's going to be better or worse for the democracy, right? So that's the motion we're going to do today, that we would ban children of politics from contesting in elections. And I think there are two major contentions in this debate. Firstly, the impact on the democracy. Is it good or is it bad for the democracy? What kind of impact do these dynasties have? Is it still a free and fair vote if people vote for a few families all the time, or most of the time? Will banning lead to a better or worse solution, right? So the first contention is how it really impacts the democracy. Is the democracy broken or is it still functioning? The second contention is how it impacts the individuals. Do individuals have a right to participate regardless of these impacts? Is it fair to limit what the individual's right in this situation? Because, hey, I'm still a citizen of that country at the end of the day. Okay, so I think those are the two major contentions in this debate. Let's get to more details and look specifically at how the teams should approach this. So on government. Now I think it's going to be a little bit tricky on government. Most people's intuition is that you shouldn't stop someone from contesting, and you should just trust the electorate to vote, right? So as long as the democracy is free and fair, and I have access to media, and I have the right and a fairly educated population, then what's the harm? Let people vote. Okay, so I think that's the challenge on government, is to kind of break this utopia and show that democracies are not like level, that democracies depend, or elections, or winning elections depend on how much influence you have, right? On how much power you have, how much money you have, how much name branding, how much value you have. And all of these things are bad, and it's hard to control all of these things, but we try. We try to control the amount of money, we try to make that stuff public, we try to, in some countries, they limit your sources of funding, right? And so it's consistent with those things to ban these dynasties, right? So that's, on Gov, you really need to show how the democracy is not perfect. In fact, it can be broken, and how this leads to a better democracy, right? So well, let's be structured. So I think the three main arguments you can run on Gov, well, among many others, is firstly the impact on the democracy, how it distorts the democracy and how it's bad. Secondly, talking about the politicians themselves, why this is a special case, right? And why, because they have more power, they need to take more responsibility. And thirdly, kind of check and balance around the rights of these politicians or these individuals, and how they still manage to get more rights, so they're not in such a bad situation, okay, so that their rights are still protected, right? So let's look at them in turn. Firstly, how it distorts the democracy. And this was some part of what I was talking about earlier, that show that democracies depend on, or elections rather, depend on the power that individuals have, their ability to persuade other people to vote for them. So if I'm more famous, then I get more votes, okay? But it's not just about the celebrity status, not just about money, it's also about political networking. And dynasties, political dynasties, get all of these major things. They have popularity and fame, right, like celebrities. They have money, like billionaires, very often. And thirdly, they have political networks, okay, like other, politicians. So they have this troika of power, the magic three that ties everything together and makes them incredibly powerful and makes them really, really hard to beat, right? And you can say that, so voting these people in, so it distorts democracy firstly because it doesn't create a level playing field, and these people have an incredible advantage over others, okay? But it also distorts democracy when they keep winning because it maintains like a certain line of power and idea. The son will want to continue the father's legacy. It's much, much less likely that they will change what is happening, right, before, or be negative about it, right? I mean, that's what a lot of people said George Bush Jr. was doing, which is finishing George Bush Sr.'s war in Iraq when he invaded it again. Okay, so we think that and this is the second way it possibly distorts democracy. It doesn't allow these ideas to grow as much as it would. I mean, granted, political parties will tend to have a continuity, but political families, that continuity is much, much stronger and is negative for the democracy, right? Dilutes the value of the democracy, discourages its growth, right? But secondly, we say that politicians are a special case of individual. So not just controlling parties or democracy, but when you look at politicians specifically, and especially politicians with a huge amount of power, because they have so much power, we expect more from them, right? They need to take this trade-off, and it's something that politicians accept in other areas of life too. They have a larger trade-off in terms of their transparency, trade-offs in terms of the jobs that they can do and they cannot do, in terms of their conflicts. And we think this is one of those trade-offs, right, that they need to accept. That if you have so much power, that power shouldn't extend beyond a generation, right? Because you have power over the entire country. I think it's helpful here to talk about how politicians differ from other roles. Like if I was a CEO of a company, many of them pass on power to my children. That's not always a good idea, but maybe it's acceptable because the impact is much less. But also there are more powerful checks and balances there. If my company does badly, the CEO is going to get fired. But we don't see this that often with politics. Yeah, sometimes if the country does disastrously bad, then whenever the next election is, maybe the change will happen. But many times, politicians just argue, fight among each other. We see political dynasties ebb and flow. So even if you lose power, you come back to power the next time. You lose power this time, you come back to power again, right? So it becomes like a cycle that isn't really broken. Okay, and we think that's partly to do with the nature of politics and what makes politicians especially different. Okay, and I think that's your second argument. In the first argument, you talked about democracy and how democracy is not really even and balanced. In the second argument, talk about politicians specifically and say why their role is different, how they're not susceptible to the same types of checks and balances, how because of the great power and responsibility they have, this is something that they should accept that comes with the job. The third argument I think you can run on Gov is how the rights of politicians can still be protected, their rights as an individual, right? That they can still, will, number one, influence the democratic process as an individual, like any other individual can. They just can't run for election. So I can volunteer, I can vote, I can campaign, right? I can have that kind of impact, and that impact is much different than if I was myself running, if I was myself in power, right? So you can talk about how they still have their rights protected, that it's still like, it's this fair trade-off that they can get, that they're not losing that much more and becoming every other kind of, normal citizen, okay? And that's fair, and that's, so they're not losing a democratic right, that it's a trade-off because, they were part of an incredibly powerful family. Okay, so those are the major arguments I think you run on Gov here. The most important one is the notion of the democracy being distorted, and how these political dynasties themselves have a huge impact on the distortion of that democracy. Okay, so that's the Gov side. What about on the Op side? Okay, on the Op side, I think your line is clearer. Okay, the three major arguments that you can run on Op, among many others. Firstly, the right of an individual, and in every democracy, that right of an individual has to be guaranteed equally with everyone else. Secondly, checks and balances. The democratic system will check itself, and these individuals may even be checked more than other individuals. And thirdly, how this will harm politics forever and ever more, and in many, many, many different ways. Okay, so let's look through these arguments on Op. Firstly, right of the individual. Pretty straightforward, right? It's a democracy, everybody has this right, and you can't remove that right. You don't hold me responsible for the sins of my father. So if my father did something good, bad, or whatever, then that shouldn't impact me. I should have the equal and free right to do whatever I want, right? And running for elections is the ultimate democratic right. It is the highest level of participation in a democracy. So don't just defend rights generally, focus specifically on the right to campaign, to run for elections, to lead. It is the highest calling of civil service, right? Painted in like this very honorable thing, and to a large extent it is, right? It's something that not many people want to do. As much as you criticize politicians, very few of us would actually do those things, right? So for the people who want to do it, we should encourage them to do it. And maybe you're more likely to do it when you see your father do it or your family members do it, and it's portrayed in a more positive thing to you. The same way, being a teacher is more positive if your family members were teachers. Of course, this can work the other way. You maybe never want to be a teacher because your father was a teacher, and some children never want to be politicians because their parents were politicians, right? But either way, you talk about why it should be that individual's right and that choice. It's not always automatic, but if they decide that they want to be involved in politics, you should let them do it because it's their right, right? So I think that's the first argument to run on Op, and the most powerful argument, and one that you should run strongly, proudly, and keep defending throughout the debate. The second argument is about the checks and balances that exist in the system. It's hard to ignore the government's arguments that democracy is not flat and always fair, free, that people with money will influence, and so on and so forth. So on Op, I don't think you can say that this is not true, but you can say that many different people have access to these things. And what governments or what democratic systems need to do is create opportunity. And if you can be an unknown person and still succeed, like Jokowi in Indonesia, like many people say the path that Obama took, that he wasn't from a political dynasty, although he did have some his life story was different and unique. But that means that many different people in many different contexts and backgrounds and situations can still succeed, right? And as long as all of these people can still succeed in one way or another, then we don't need to have this terrible, archaic restriction on political dynasties, right? That we should trust the system. As long as the system is transparent and the system is fair, and you can say if there's a problem, fix the system in some other way, right? Limit funding, have more transparency, give money to people so they can run, and etc., etc., etc. But don't limit the right, and don't think that people are stupid. You should trust your electorate, trust your citizens, empower them, give them more information, and let them make the best choice, rather than removing their information and making it harder for them to choose, or restricting the number of choices that they can make. Okay, so that's the second thing, the check and balances that exist within the system and why you should trust the system. Last but not least, talk about how it harms politics. How maybe these people are good and they can be great, amazing leaders, but you're discouraging them from running. In some situations, they could be better placed to be politicians because they understand what sacrifices are required. They've seen their parents go through this process. So when they make this choice, they are doing it with a kind of awareness that very few people have, right? They've been trained to deal with public attention throughout their lives. So they're more ready for this role, and then will end up doing this job better. Now, be careful a little bit here though, because this is exactly the kind of thing that Gov says is bad. This is exactly the kind of argument people use to support the monarchy, that the son of a king is much better placed to rule because he's better educated, he's more aware, he's used to the court proceedings, and that means other people are less capable of ruling because you don't know what it's like to rule. You didn't grow up in a court, so you can't expect a common person to rule. Okay, so now this is not what you're saying on op. You're not saying not anybody can rule, but you're saying that these individuals can bring something too. And other than just their own individual experiences, they bring a familiarity with the political process. It's up to the people whether that familiarity is a good thing or a bad thing. If people don't like politics, if they think politics is broken, then it's less likely they're going to vote for people who grew up through that process, right? But if these individuals can prove themselves, then why not? Okay, so denying these individuals participation as a candidate is denying the entire nation of possible benefits and denying the entire nation of possible progress, right? So that's the major lines of argumentation you run on op. Focus very much on the rights of individuals, the trust that you have in the system, and then talk about the possible benefits that you could have from these individuals participating, and if you don't allow them to participate, it leads to harms. Okay, so in the role of the individual within the political system, or the role of a small group of individuals within the political system, it's a very, very tricky debate. Okay, in the end of the day, it's the truth is that the systems are not fair, and systems are continuously evolving. That people vote for many different reasons. Some of the reasons good, bad, but it's those individuals' reasons. But when the system becomes really distorted, when the same group of individuals win over and over and over again, then is that system really fair? Then is that system really reflecting the will of the people, or is that system reflecting a broken structure, the rights and powers of a few over everyone else? And this few then keep shaping the system to vote them back in and vote them back in. And even if they compete against different families, it's still those families that are in control of everyone else. And even if it's 5, 6, 7 families, it's still a very, very small, minuscule percentage of the entire population. It's one class of people ruling over the other, right? So is this a problem? How severe is this problem? But even if this is a problem, is this an appropriate solution? By banning the children of these politicians, are you breaking the generational gap? Or are you just letting other families rule? Are you removing the responsibility from the citizens and saying that it's up to the citizens to be aware and to vote someone else, or up for someone else to come in and break this stranglehold on power. And last but not least, how does it affect the individuals, the politicians? Is this overstating their role? Is it removing fundamental rights that they have? Or is it fair, Because tough luck for politicians, right? This is the nature of the game. I don't know, but very, very, very interesting debates, relevant to you, whether or not you decide if you want to become a politician or not, right? Because whether or not you want to be in politics, there is someone in politics right now who is affecting your life through politics. So happy debating about politics.